Welcome to Stories of Brave Mothers, a channel dedicated to telling real and touching stories of brave mothers from around the world.
Imagine reaching the age of 50 without knowing how to read, and suddenly realizing that this is keeping you from helping the people you love most. This is the story of Margaret, a brave mother who, after years of humiliation and silence, made the most courageous decision of her life to learn to read so she could support her daughter and help her grandsons with their schoolwork. A journey of stumbles, tears, and triumph, proving that it's never too late to rewrite your own destiny. In a small neighborhood of modest homes in Savannah, Georgia, life moved at a slow, almost lazy pace. Mornings were marked by the smell of fresh brewed coffee and the distant sound of school buses picking up children at the corners. Among these houses was the home of Margaret Hayes, a 50-year-old woman with calloused hands, a shy smile, and eyes that carried stories no one fully knew. To everyone, Margaret was simply the friendly lady who's always there to help the neighbors with anything physical, gardening, sewing, caring for the elderly. But she guarded one secret more tightly than any treasure. Margaret couldn't read. Not that she had never tried. As a child, growing up in a very poor family in rural Alabama, Margaret's world revolved around plantations and heavy farm work. School was a distant luxury. Her father would say, "Work puts food on the table, not the words on a page." So the little girl learned to memorize whatever she needed, recognize places by visual landmarks, and rely on others to read labels, signs, and any important document. Over the years, she developed an almost magical ability to hide her limitation. But hiding it didn't mean living without fear. Every letter in the mail, every medical form, every note sent home for her daughter, Emily, was a silent threat. Margaret always had an excuse. "My eyesight's bad today. Can you read it for me?" Or, "I'll look at it later when I have time." Eventually, these tricks became automatic reflexes. Emily, now an adult and mother of 2 boys, ages 8 and 10, lived just a few blocks away. She worked as a cashier at a supermarket and relied heavily on her mother for childcare. Margaret was, in fact, the most constant presence in her grandsons' lives, taking them to school, cooking dinner, attending their band performances. But in recent months, something had begun to change. The boys were bringing home more and more homework involving reading, comprehension, and writing. One rainy afternoon in November, the truth finally surfaced. Emily came home later than usual from work, exhausted, and found her mother sitting at the kitchen table, a school notebook open in front of her, the 2 boys fidgeting beside her. "Grandma, you're not helping, right?" complained the older one. Noah, with the blunt honesty only children have, "The homework says something else. Look." He pointed to a reading question. While Margaret smiled awkwardly and looked away, Emily immediately sensed the tension in the air. "Mom, what's going on?" she asked, sitting down beside her. Margaret took a deep breath but didn't answer. Emily picked up the notebook, read the prompter, and realized the answer Margaret had helped them with had nothing to do with the question. She looked at her mother, who now kept her eyes fixed on the floor. That's when the youngest, Ethan, said innocently, "Mommy, Grandma doesn't know how to read, does she?" The silence that followed was heavy. Margaret felt her face burn. Emily, startled, told the boys to go play in their room. Once they were alone, she tried to ease the tension. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me?" Margaret shrugged, but the tears were already there, begging to fall. Because it's too much shame. Emily, I've spent my life making excuses. People think it's stupidity, and I let them believe it." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the rain pounding harder against the window. Emily took her mother's hand, trying to show support, but Margaret was already sinking into memories of the last time she had felt that deep humiliation. It had been 2 months earlier, at the supermarket where she did her weekly shopping. Margaret was in the checkout line, cart full, with her grandsons at her side. The cashier, a young woman in a hurry, asked her to sign the digital receipt. Not knowing what was written, Margaret simply scribbled something. The young woman rolled her eyes and said loud enough for the whole line to hear, "Ma'am, that's not a signature. Can't you at least write your own name?" A muffled laugh from someone behind her, and the stares of strangers burned into Margaret's skin like fire. She laughed nervously, pretending her hand was stiff that day. But inside, something cracked. Now, sitting in that kitchen with the weight of the truth laid bare before her daughter, Margaret felt the same mixture of shame and helplessness. Emily took a deep breath. "Mom, you take care of my kids better than anyone. It doesn't matter if you can read or not, but if you want, I can help you." Margaret lifted her eyes for the first time, and right there, in that kitchen lit by a warm yellow bulb and the sound of rain, a seed began to sprout. That night, Margaret went to bed early but didn't sleep. She thought about Noah's face when he realized she couldn't understand the homework. She thought about the cashier's laugh, and she thought about her own childhood and how different it could have been if someone had insisted she learn. Maybe there was still time to change, but learning to read at 50, that seemed like an impossible mountain to climb. And deep down, the fear of being embarrassed again still chained her in place. The next day, when she went to pick up her grandsons from school, Margaret noticed a colorful poster near the gate. Community Adult Literacy Program. Enroll now. She stopped, looked at the big letters, and recognized a few words only by their shape. A chill ran down her spine. It was as if the poster was speaking directly to her. In the car, while the boys chattered excitedly about their day, Margaret stayed silent, chewing on the thought. That night, alone, she called Emily. "Honey, if I wanted to learn, do you think I could?" On the other end, Emily couldn't hold back her smile. "You can, Mom, and I'll be with you every step of the way." Margaret didn't know it yet, but that decision was the first step in a journey that would change not only her life, but also Emily's and her grandsons. A journey that would begin with stumbles, tears, and inevitably, new moments of embarrassment. But that, in the end, would reveal the strength that had always been there, hidden, waiting to be read, word by word. The first class of the community literacy program was on a Tuesday, inside Savannah's public library. The room smelled of freshly cleaned carpet. The air conditioning was colder than it needed to be, and Margaret stood for a few seconds in front of the glass door, looking at her own reflection, hair pulled back in a simple bun, floral blouse, nervous hands. She pushed the door open. A circle of chairs awaited her. In the center, a sign written in marker read, "Welcome, Mrs. Carter," a soft-spoken teacher with glasses hanging from a chain, greeted each student. Beside her, volunteer Mr. Alvarez handed out notebooks. The initial assessment was the first test. Mrs. Carter gave them a sheet with simple words. The first one was cat. Looked easy. 3 letters. But when it was Margaret's turn, the silence in the room seemed to grow. "A," she hesitated, trying to blend the sounds. "Kate?" No one laughed, but Margaret's face burned. Mrs. Carter came closer. "Let's try together. First the sound of C, then the A, and finally the T. Now put it all together. Cat," Margaret repeated, more firmly this time. Cat. It was just one word, but it felt like she had climbed a mountain. In the days that followed, she stuck labels on household objects: door, chair, spoon. With Emily's help, she wanted to practice, even if it seemed silly for someone her age. One afternoon, Noah's friend saw the labels and laughed, asking what they were for. Noah quickly said it was a word hunt game. Margaret gave a half smile, grateful for her grandson's protection. The second test of patience came at Ethan's pediatric appointment. Emily couldn't go, so Margaret took him. The receptionist handed her a tablet to fill out the registration form. She recognized allergies, but the rest looked like a riddle. The line behind her grew restless. The receptionist eventually took the tablet and typed it in herself, without even looking her in the eye. Ethan held her hand, sensing her discomfort. When they got home, Margaret told Emily, "I'm not going through that again. Teach me how to fill out those forms." The next lessons were more practical. Mrs. Carter brought copies of everyday forms, school enrollment, medical history, small requests. Margaret chose a school permission slip, and with patience, Mr. Alvarez helped her decode each line. When she managed to read the entire document, the class gave her a small round of applause. Practicing with her grandsons became a ritual. Noah started hiding short notes around the house. Check the porch. Look under the pillow. Every time Margaret read one correctly, they'd do the word dance together, a mix of laughter and pride. Still, the old shame would creep in. One neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, saw Margaret with a notebook and said, "At your age, what's the point now? You've worked so much already." Margaret smiled, but kept the comment like a thorn in her chest. Instead of stopping, she opened her notebook that same afternoon and read until her coffee went cold. Progress began to show. At the supermarket, she started looking for products by their written name, not by the picture. At church, she followed the hymnal with her finger, recognizing simple words like love and the biggest challenge came when the church announced Family Literacy Day, a reading event for families. Emily looked at her mother expectantly. Margaret brushed it off. But that night, alone, she thought about what it would mean for Noah and Ethan. At the next class, she pulled Mrs. Carter aside. "Do you think I could read a passage on Sunday? If you practice with purpose, not with fear, you can na," the teacher replied. Her grandsons were her first audience. Sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, they corrected each stumble with patience. On Saturday, during rehearsal, a man from the choir asked, "Are you sure you won't just blank out?" Margaret answered without hesitation, "I might, but I know how to find my place again." On Sunday, the church was full. Margaret stepped up with the little book in her hands. She looked at her grandsons and began, "Once upon a time, there was a little girl who thought words were like doors." She trembled over a few words, but finished the passage. The respectful silence was followed by applause that felt like a warm embrace. Noah and Ethan ran up to her, and right there, they did the word dance. On the drive home, Margaret looked out the car window. Signs, billboards, notices, they were all beginning to make sense. She knew she still had much to learn, but now, with each challenge, she felt less fear and more drive, and deep down, she had the sense that something bigger was coming, something that would make this brave mother use every new word to change her family's destiny. Spring in Savannah arrived like a relief after a winter that seemed longer than usual. The streets filled with flowers, and the gentle warmth invited people out for walks. Margaret kept faithfully attending her Tuesday and Thursday classes, but something inside her was already different. It wasn't just her reading that was changing. It was the way she walked through the city. Before, she would avoid looking at signs, as if the letters were intruders. Now, she sought them out. Noah and Ethan noticed the change too. One afternoon, after coming home from school, the boys asked for help with a science project about planets. Emily was at work, and Margaret took a deep breath before saying, yes. She sat with them at the kitchen table, opened the textbook, and began decoding the sentences slowly. Jupiter is the largest planet. She repeated the words, helping her grandsons understand. When they finished, Noah looked at her with a wide grin. "Grandma, you read just like Mom." The words echoed in Margaret's heart like music. The turning point began to take shape when Emily received a letter from Noah's school. The envelope was thick, with the school's logo in the corner. She left it on the table before heading to her night shift, asking her mother to put it away. Margaret stared at the letter for hours, pacing the house. In the past, she would have waited for her daughter to open it, but something about that day seemed to ask for courage. She sat down, put on her glasses, and carefully opened the envelope. The first words were familiar. "Dear parent." She read slowly, word by word, until she understood it was an invitation to a special meeting about Noah's academic performance and a family reading incentive program. Margaret smiled to herself. She not only understood the letter, she knew she could explain it to Emily when she got home. For the first time, she felt she had crossed the line from depending on others to being able to help. On the day of the meeting, Margaret decided to go with her daughter. They sat in the room with other parents, and the teacher began speaking about how family involvement was essential for a child's development. At one point, she asked the parents present to read aloud a short excerpt from a motivational text. An uncomfortable silence spread. Margaret knew she could stay quiet, but Emily looked at her with that spark only daughters who believe in their mothers have. Margaret raised her hand. She received the paper, took a deep breath, and began. Every child deserves someone who believes in them. Her voice was steady. Each word came out clear. When she finished, she heard a discreet, "Well done," from the teacher. But what mattered most was Emily's proud smile and the boys clapping softly in their seats. That night, Emily shared something she had been keeping to herself. "Mom, I told the coordinator about you. I told her your story, and she wants you to speak at the next community literacy event." Margaret almost said no immediately. Speaking in public, admitting she hadn't known how to read until recently. But as she sipped her coffee, she thought about the cashier at the supermarket, the receptionist at the pediatrician's office, the neighbor who doubted her, and her grandsons. Maybe telling her story was more than personal courage. Maybe it was clearing the path for others. The event took place in the school gym, with dozens of people seated. Margaret stepped onto the small stage, holding a paper she had written herself, with Emily's help only in revising it. She began by describing what it was like to depend on others for anything that involved reading. She spoke of the humiliation, but also of the decision to change at age 50. "I didn't learn to read to change my past," she said, looking out at the crowd. "I learned to change my family's future." The words echoed. Some people wiped tears from their eyes, and in the corner, Noah and Ethan clapped with visible pride. When she stepped off the stage, a woman came up to her, moved, and said, "I can't read either. Do you think it's too late for me?" Margaret took her hands. "It's never too late. If I could do it, you can too." That night, at home, Emily hugged her tightly. "Mom, you're not just my inspiration. You're an inspiration to so many people now." Margaret smiled but said nothing. She went to the table, picked up her notebook, and slowly wrote a simple sentence that summed up everything she felt. "I can read." She closed the notebook, turned off the light, and went to sleep, with the certainty that the words she had learned were not just letters on a page. They were keys, and with them, this brave mother had opened doors that would change her family forever. How many times do we put our dreams on hold, thinking our time has already passed? Margaret showed us that the right time is now, and that the love of a brave mother can overcome any barrier. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to our channel to keep sharing these powerful emotions with us. Leave your like and share, because maybe someone you know just needs to hear that it's never too late to start again.